Following Spider-Man No Way Home, I think it's fair to say that Peter Parker's life has been turned completely upside down. The once geeky high school student is now in a world where he has to live his life as not only an adult, but an adult without anyone to lean on. His Aunt May is dead, his best friends have no memory of him, and the world no longer remembers that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And with Peter Parker's future in the MCU now looking incredibly bleak, you have to wonder, what exactly are they going to be doing with this now isolated character? What exactly could they do with this newly depressed Peter Parker in our next Spider-Man movie? Hey guys, my name is DJ and welcome to What They Should Make, a show in which I take a look at a future story from the world of movies, video games, what have you, before creating my own version of that particular tale. And for today's episode, I want to tackle the rather interesting future of one Peter Parker. As I mentioned a few moments ago, Peter Parker's life in the MCU has never been worse. His family, his friends, everyone he's ever cared about is gone, and there's nothing left except Spider-Man. In this depressing state for Peter Parker is actually the thing I find most intriguing about his next movie. We've never really seen him without any sort of backup before, and I find it really fascinating. Which, in the case of this story that I have laid out for you today, is the aspect of Peter Parker's life that I want to focus on the most. But don't you worry, I haven't forgotten about that little Venom tease that we saw at the end of No Way Home. In fact, his existence in this universe is perfect for my version of Peter Parker who has officially hit an all-time low. But more on him later. For now, let us begin my own version of the MCU's Spider-Man 4. So our story begins with a good old-fashioned prison riot. We see the inmates going absolutely crazy with mayhem all over the courtyard. But this mayhem is just a distraction as 3 inmates use all of this chaos to make their escape. And the 3 inmates who escape? The Vulture, Shocker, and Mac Gargan. The 3 inmates run into the streets of New York, newly free men, as Mac Gargan decides to go off on his own, with Shocker and Vulture going off as a pair in their own separate direction. But as they separate through the streets of New York, we see a little black goo watching on from the sewers. It starts to slither towards Vulture and Shocker, following them as they make their escape. But with all the villains in this movie now going off into their own stories, why don't we take a look at how Peter Parker is doing? And, well, to put it bluntly, Peter Parker is not doing so hot. His hair's a mess, he's sweaty, he's sprinting, and he's just not looking too well. However, he does eventually make it to his job working at a pizza place, my little callback to Spider-Man 2. And just like in Spider-Man 2, Peter Parker gets yelled at for, well, always being late. But even though Peter is trying his best to apologize, the manager simply doesn't want to hear it and tells him that he has a delivery to make. So Peter delivers his pizza to an apartment building and sees none other than MJ, who opens the door. Because, with Peter Parker's luck, of course it's her who ordered the pizza. However, before Peter gets the chance to say anything, we see Ned Leeds answering the door alongside MJ. And, of course, he takes the pizza away from Peter before kissing MJ on the cheek. So, yeah, this kiss obviously reveals that Ned and MJ are in a relationship, as Peter is just left to stand there in his heartbreak. But speaking of complicated relationships, why don't we cut back over to Vulture and Shocker, the 2 recently escaped convicts who can be seen arguing in their old hideout from Homecoming. They start disagreeing on what their next move should be now that they're out of prison. Shocker wants to go back to a life of crime and wants to get his revenge on Spider-Man for putting them in jail. Meanwhile, the Vulture just wants to go back to his wife and Liz. His family were the whole reason he even started committing crime in the first place, and now he wants to try and mend his relationship with them. Eventually, they decide to split up, with Shocker going on to get his revenge against Spider-Man, and Vulture going on to rekindle his life with his family. And while Vulture goes back to try and be with his family, we go back over to Spider-Man, who is just having a very lonely life these days. We see Peter's internal reaction to the whole Ned and MJ romance that we just saw a few moments ago. He walks into his apartment angry and confused. To see his two former best friends as a couple? That has to upset him. He sits down, taking a single breath of anger before the police scanner on his phone interrupts this emotional moment. Of course, Peter doesn't really get the time to properly process his emotions. So Peter angrily swings out of his window to go and stop a local robbery at a jewelry store, which is really just the site of a newly escaped Shocker who is using this little robbery as a way to draw out Spider-Man. But when Shocker starts his little monologue towards Spider-Man, he gets interrupted by a punch in the face. Yeah, Peter is just too pissed off to deal with this bullshit. In fact, this anger of his becomes the main focal point of this entire fight. As they go back and forth, Peter's anger starts to take hold of him. He starts becoming more and more ruthless, with Shocker laying in a bloody heap on the ground. However, during the fight, Shocker finds a moment of hesitation in which he throws Spider-Man across the building before quickly escaping this now ruthless and relentless Spider-Man. Eventually, Spidey does wake up and get back on his feet. And as he gets back up and walks away, he starts to realize that he might have gone a little too far with his anger during that last fight. But of course, there is that little black goo watching on, smirking at the sight of this wall crawler that he has so desperately wanted since first seeing him on the news at the end of Let There Be Carnage. However, before we continue with what happens there, I want to take this opportunity to tie a little neat bow on the story of Vulture. So we cut back to see Vulture driving past a sign saying "Welcome to Oregon," signaling that he is going to see his family a few days after escaping prison. He eventually arrives at the house of his old family, the house of his wife and now all grown up daughter. But instead of a loving family reunion, his wife answers the door with disgust and horror. They start to get into a hushed argument where she tells him to leave and never come back. Their life is already hard enough as it is with them being related to the Vulture. And as much as he would love to just force his way back into that house and force his way back within his own family, he understands and realizes what she's saying. So after taking a deep breath, now sad and angry, the Vulture decides to leave the house of his family. All while Liz watches on from the window of the house. Which, I mean, none of that really matters to the overall point of the story, but I really like the idea of that scene just existing as a way to tie up all loose threads. And following that conversation, we see that Vulture is now getting a phone call from Shocker. Vulture answers and Shocker is in a panic. Shocker says that Spider-Man is acting so ruthless that he just needs some help. If Shocker has any hope of fighting this new ruthless version of Spider-Man, then he needs the Vulture. And Vulture just sits there before saying that he'll meet him back at the hideout. So now, Shocker and Vulture have reunited right before we see Spider-Man team up with a new, eerie friend. We cut over to Peter, who sits there furious at his life before he looks up and sees a picture of Aunt May on his desk. This then turns his anger into an intense sadness as life has continuously and mercilessly beaten him down since No Way Home. But of course, instead of dealing with his actual emotions, Peter chooses to channel his anger into action as he goes to prepare for a nightly patrol as Spider-Man. But as Peter swings out of his window, we see Venom quickly lunge onto his back in midair. And we see the Venom symbiote start to form around Peter Parker in midair as he's trying to swing and navigate his way through New York. And this growing black ooze that is just freaking Peter Parker out interrupts his swinging to the point where he hits a wall and falls down crashing into a back alleyway. But as Peter is starting to wake up, he starts to hear the voice of Venom in the back of his head.
Haha, finally a specimen that I can actually use. You and I, Peter, we will be the lethal protectors.
Peter is clearly terrified and confused by all of this, as Venom continues talking in the back of his head. However, he gets interrupted as a gang starts to form around Spider-Man in this back alleyway. Of course, they go to attack this new Black Spider-Man, but they have no idea what they're in for. Venom decides to take over the fight, instructing Spider-Man on what to do before helping him to take down those guys physically. Just like in the Venom movie, we essentially see him fighting for Spider-Man and beating down the gang around him. After they take those guys down, and after Venom showcases his potential to Peter, they both decide to swing up to a nearby rooftop and have a conversation. Peter, while very confused, is in shock and awe. He has no clue what to say, while Venom is so excited that he won't shut up. Venom keeps saying how after that fight, they can make for a good team. Venom had a guy he fought with before in Eddie Brock, but now he's gone. But with Peter, they could take on the threats of New York as a duo and nobody would be able to stop them. Peter, clearly confused by all of this, just sits there before admitting that he does like the power that he feels with Venom. So, while confused, Spider-Man agrees to be friends with Venom. So now we finally have a team up between Peter Parker and Venom in the MCU. And this leads to a montage showing how Venom is actually helping Peter get his life back together. In the montage, we see Venom and Spider-Man quickly taking down bad guys together in the black suit, we see Peter finally getting to work on time, and we see Peter generally seeming happier with the Venom symbiote. But at the end of this montage is a loud scream that can be heard in the distance. So naturally, Peter and Venom head off together as newfound best friends. And what they find is a mugging, as Ned and MJ are the victims of an ongoing assault. And after quickly dispatching of those crooks, Peter is just left to stand there staring at his two former best friends, not sure what to do, all while that little voice in the back of his head is telling him to take off his mask and show them and explain to them the whole situation. But instead, Peter decides to swallow his sadness and swing away once again to a nearby rooftop. And this leads Peter to an internal argument with himself, wishing that he could just go back and tell them everything. Venom even encourages it as well, pushing him towards making that decision so they can focus on being a great team and not all of this emotional crap. But of course, that voice of Venom is really just an external voice for Peter because, well, Venom feels exactly what Peter is feeling since they have that symbiotic relationship. Venom then decides to tell him the story of his former friend in Eddie Brock. He tells him this story about how Eddie was so obsessed with his former girlfriend Anne, and how that obsession, that sadness, turned him into a worse person for it because he just kept denying himself of what he needed. And after Venom gets done with this story, Peter starts to feel justified in his desires. He finally says that he is done being unhappy. He does all of this stuff for everyone else, and now he wants to finally do something for himself. After constantly struggling through life without Aunt May, without Ned, and without MJ, he admits that life has been easier with a friend like Venom. So after this heavy conversation, he makes a decision. After work, Peter will head over to MJ's apartment and lay it all out. He will finally try to get his life back. And later that evening, Peter makes his way over to MJ's apartment building. He looks up through the window, seeing the woman he still loves, ready to go ahead and tell her what is going on. That is, before hearing police sirens and people screaming in the distance down the street. And even though Venom tells him to ignore it, Peter knows deep down that he has to go check out what's happening. So, once again, his life gets interrupted with his duties of being Spider-Man. And it turns out that this interruption is in the form of Vulture and Shocker as they destroy buildings and cause chaos, looking to lure Spider-Man out so they can have their revenge. And the fight is on as the team of Vulture and Shocker take on the black-suited Spider-Man. And even though Spidey has the Venom symbiote, the 2-on-1 disadvantage starts to wear him down a bit. And during this beatdown, Vulture sends him flying towards some of the fire created through the chaos, where we see Venom immediately start to react to it. Venom sends Shocker flying off, knocking him out before turning his attention over to Vulture. And even though Peter is trying to take back control of the suit, Venom's fear and anger is too overwhelming as he beats down Vulture without giving up control at all. And during this anger, during this rage, Venom decides to grab a nearby sharp object. And while Peter screams at Venom not to do this from within inside the suit, Venom refuses and stabs Vulture. Venom kills the Vulture, the father of Peter's first crush, and the first ever real supervillain that Peter Parker ever faced in the MCU. A crowd of people start to form around them in shock at what they're seeing. They watch as Spider-Man, of all people, kills one of his villains. And in the crowd, of course, is MJ, who watches on in disgust at this menace. Spidey gets up, weak and in tears, before quickly swinging off to a nearby rooftop of one of the burning buildings. Peter and Venom argue, with Peter pissed off that Venom just decided to take over the fight and kill Vulture. And while Venom tries to defend himself, Peter just doesn't want to hear it. He takes off the black suit and throws it away on the rooftop, screaming at Venom that killing Vulture goes against everything he stands for. Him killing Vulture goes against everything Aunt May stood for. Venom tries to talk back, but Peter just picks up the black suit and throws it towards the fire on the building. Peter watches on as the Venom starts to dissipate away from the fire, going down the side of the building into a nearby alleyway. But we continue to watch Venom as it slithers down the building before noticing Mac Gargan once again nearby, looking at the commotion from the alleyway. Venom then smiles and lunges towards Mac Gargan before attaching himself to the recently escaped convict. Venom has a new host, and it's already someone who hates Spider-Man for putting him in prison. But after all of this madness, we cut back over to Peter in his apartment. His regret, his sadness, and his internal battle starts to take hold of him once again as he looks at a picture of Aunt May. He stares at it before apologizing profusely as he has a mental breakdown, saying that being Spider-Man has done nothing but hurt him. Tony Stark, Vulture, and Aunt May would all still be alive if he wasn't around, and for that, he's so sorry. Peter finally collapses, leaning against the wall, crying and at his breaking point. And as Peter Parker sits there in his sadness, we cut back over to Mac Gargan and Venom. Gargan essentially says that he wants to kill Peter Parker for putting him in prison, and Venom wants to punish him as well for abandoning him when Venom was just trying to help to do the right thing. So this little conversation is basically just Mac Gargan and Venom agreeing that they're going to punish and kill Peter Parker. And as the Green Goblin would say, if you want to punish someone, all you have to do is attack their heart. And this all leads, of course, to MJ. Peter comes home the next day from work to see his entire apartment trashed and destroyed. But the main thing Peter notices among the chaos is his framed photo. What was once another photo of Aunt May is now a photo of a gagged MJ on top of the Empire State Building. Peter just stands there before once again looking over at his picture of Aunt May that he was apologizing to the night before. He looks at it, remembering the good times they had and how he doesn't want to let her down. He needs to continue her legacy. Even though he may be going through a tough time, and even though saving MJ might be hard, Peter needs to remember what Spider-Man is all about.
And with great power, there must also come great responsibility.
In this newfound mixture of anger and memories pushes Peter Parker. So naturally, we cut to the final battle as this rejuvenated red and blue Spider-Man takes on the darkness of Venom. Finally, Peter Parker is ready to move toward the future by putting to rest his past mistakes, starting with Venom. And the two start brawling on top of the Empire State Building, going back and forth as news reporters start to surround the building from the ground. And amongst this crowd of onlookers is, of course, the boyfriend of the kidnapped MJ in Ned Leeds. The brawl continues above, with Venom seemingly winning the fight. And in a rage, Venom shouts that he is sick of being a hero. He tried to be a good guy with Eddie Brock, and it failed. He tried to be a good guy with Peter, and it failed again. Well, if everyone wants him to be this monster that they all see him as, then fine. Peter broke his heart, and now he'll break Peter's. So the newly evil Venom decides to grab MJ and throw her off the Empire State Building. Peter then quickly jumps off of the building, diving towards MJ, before Venom follows suit and the two start brawling in midair. Before Peter launches Venom back into the Empire State Building and continues his dive towards MJ. He shoots out his web, ready to catch MJ, but just like Gwen Stacy in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Peter is just too late. Even though he catches her with the web, she still hits the ground hard enough to die. MJ dies in front of Peter, Ned, and an entire crowd of people. Ned screams out in shock and horror before holding MJ closely in his arms. But before Peter can even fully process what just happened, that son of a bitch Venom lunges towards him and they continue fighting. And during this brawl, Venom launches Peter towards a nearby restaurant with the entire crowd of people quickly evacuating. They brawl into the kitchen, throwing each other around before a small fire starts around them. But of course, Peter doesn't care. He's angry and sad, and just like in the beginning of the movie, he is ruthless in his attacks. But no matter how badly Peter is beating him down, Venom just can't help but laugh in his face. Venom laughs, saying that Peter can't kill him. He won't do it. Peter needs Venom, and he needs the strength that only Venom can give him. Venom may have messed up before, but he is willing to once again join Peter. He is now willing to be a partner to him, so they can once again become the lethal protector. But Peter, with tears in his eyes, says that Venom is just a disease. It tried to ruin his life, and he won't let it ruin or kill anyone else. In a righteous rage, Peter picks up Venom and launches him towards the fire. Venom starts to act more with aggression and fear as he gets closer to the flames, with Matt Gargan screaming out at him, saying that he wants to kill Spider-Man. Mac then rushes towards him in a violent and ruthless rage, with Venom latching onto him tighter and tighter. But as Mac lunges towards him, Peter quickly moves out of the way, with Mac launching himself into another fire. Peter tries to save Mac from the Venom symbiote, but the fire and all the chemicals causes an explosion that sends Peter flying, leaving Mac and Venom to burn in the flames. Finally, the Venom trauma is over. Peter stands there both heartbroken and victorious before he looks out and sees Ned Leeds standing there in the street watching him. And even though Spidey tries to walk toward him, Ned has nothing to say as he walks away with fury and tears in his eyes. This leads us to a graveyard, just like the ending of Spider-Man No Way Home. But this time, it's Ned who is standing over the grave of his loved one, MJ. He looks at her grave before Peter Parker walks up and stands next to him. They have a conversation talking about how MJ was such a great person and an even better friend. And at the end of the conversation, Peter tells Ned exactly what he needed to hear all the way back when Aunt May first died in Spider-Man No Way Home. It's okay to feel hurt. It's okay to be in pain and to accept this intense loss. But Peter refused to let go for so long, and it ended up hurting someone very close to him. So, whatever Ned can do to heal, Peter will be there to help. Peter then gives him a card saying that even though Ned may not know who Peter is still there to help him in any way he can. He went through the major loss of Aunt May alone, but Ned doesn't have to. Peter walks away as Ned just looks back, feeling as though he recognizes him and has a sort of connection to him that he can't fully explain. And as we wrap the movie up, we watch as Peter gets accepted into NYU as he gets his life back on track, being accepted into college. Peter is finally putting himself first and looking ahead toward the future, as opposed to mellowing in his past. And of course, Peter starts to make friends with a young man named Harry and a young woman named Gwen. But that's all a story for another time. Oh, and to tie up our story, I also have a post-credit scene. In this scene, we watch as Ned is in his bedroom alone, looking down at a picture of MJ. And while looking at this picture, Ned starts to cry once again at this sudden loss in his life, before looking up at a report on his TV about Spider-Man. And of course, his eyes turn from sadness into anger with his newfound hatred of Spider-Man. And that is it for my version of Spider-Man 4: Home is Where I Lick My Balls. Now I know that I may have made a few controversial decisions during that story, so why don't I go ahead and kind of explain my reasoning behind them. Now I believe that killing Vulture in this story accomplishes a few things. For one, Vulture is kind of the last main character from Spider-Man's past that he may still have a connection with through his crush on Liz. After all, Peter Parker is now in this whole new chapter of his life, and any ounce of that kid in Homecoming is basically gone. Not only that, but having Vulture die in a story that, well, admittedly is much bigger than himself is, in my opinion, a really nice way to send him off. Instead of his death being there for no reason, it is the main catalyst for Peter Parker finally starting this journey of forgiveness within himself during the movie. Vulture's death becomes a major moment for Peter, which in turn gives the character even more importance than he already had. But I know that the main death that might be controversial for this video was MJ. So why don't I go through the many reasons as to why I killed off MJ in this story. For one, Peter Parker is now in a universe where MJ is officially out of his life. She's gone. He can never have that relationship with her that he once had without the whole story feeling like it's just going backwards. And, well, he's probably just going to be obsessed with her for multiple movies, so to have her die here not only puts an end to that story, but it also kind of goes along with the whole story of forgiveness and closure that I have going on. And not only does her death help close this chapter of Peter Parker's life, but it also sets up an entirely different story. In the comics, the character of Ned Leeds is actually pretty significant. He becomes a major villain for Spider-Man when he takes up the mask of the Hobgoblin. So I think that his transformation into the Hobgoblin can start with MJ's death, as it can become the catalyst for his transformation into a vengeful and psychotic person. But yeah, that's my idea for what I believe they should do in Spider-Man 4. Personally, I'm pretty excited to see what the MCU does with Spider-Man in the future. We've seen him slowly but surely become more and more independent through his time in the MCU, so it's going to be really interesting to see how he uses that independence in the future. And now, Peter can finally take all of those lessons and all of those gifts that he's gotten throughout the years and become his own man. He is finally ready to live by that motto, that with great power, no matter how alone you may feel, must also come with great responsibility. Thank you all so much for watching this video. What do you guys think of my version of Spider-Man 4? And I also want to know, what other potentially future stories do you want to see me write as well? Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and all of that good stuff. But until next time, have a good day. Bye-bye.